Hello, my friends. It's time to wake up and finally admit what this war in Ukraine really is and what it is not. It is not some noble struggle of democracy versus autocracy. It is a managed, prolonged sacrifice of a country that has been turned into a disposable battlefield so that Washington, London, Brussels, and their clients can bleed Russia at someone else's expense. And at the center of this tragedy stands a man who pretends to hold cards he simply does not have. Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky now declares he will not surrender 1 inch of Ukrainian land as part of any peace deal. It sounds heroic on television. It also seals the fate of his own country. The territories he is talking about have, in large part, already been lost on the ground. Crimea is gone and not coming back. The bulk of Luhansk and Donetsk are under Russian control. Moscow has secured a land bridge along the Sea of Azov and guaranteed water access to Crimea through territory around Kherson and Zaporizhia. You can pound the podium in London or Paris all you want. Russian artillery doesn't move because a speechwriter in Kyiv used the words legal and moral. And Zelensky's sudden obsession with legal and moral grounds would be laughable if it were not soaked in blood. This is the same man who canceled elections, the same president under whom churches are harassed, opposition media has been shut down, and political rivals have been arrested or suppressed. This is the same government that Western newspapers, 3 years late, finally admit is riddled with corruption and has siphoned off billions in Western aid. Spare us the lecture about principles. The hard reality is that Zelensky holds almost no real strategic cards. His power comes entirely from the credit line extended by NATO governments and the weapons, intelligence, and logistics pipeline run by the United States. The moment that pipeline is shut off, his army's ability to fight collapses. Everyone at the grown-ups table knows this. In Washington, Moscow, Berlin, Paris, and London, Russia holds the battlefield advantage. Washington holds the finance and weapons spigot. Kyiv is an object, not a subject, in this game. This is precisely why the current peace maneuvering is so dangerous for Ukraine. On the one hand, you have Trump and parts of the U.S. establishment quietly acknowledging what has been obvious since at least late 2022. Russia is winning, time is on Moscow's side, and Ukraine is not going to reconquer the Donbass or Crimea. On the other hand, you have a European political class in London, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, that is desperate not to admit defeat. So they drag Zelensky on tour like a mascot, pose for photos, issue joint statements about standing with Ukraine as long as it takes, and then go home to cut social programs so they can keep paying for a war their own economies can't really afford. In theory, Trump holds the simple lever that could end this conflict quickly. Turn off the weapons, turn off the money, and force Kyiv to the negotiating table with Moscow from a position of reality instead of fantasy. In practice, he faces a manufactured moral trap. Washington has spent years painting Ukraine as the righteous victim and Russia as the embodiment of evil. If Trump simply abandons Zelensky overnight, he will be accused of betraying an ally and handing Europe to Putin. The political class created a hostage, and now they don't want to be seen as the ones who killed him. So Trump, like Biden before him, plays a double game, complaining publicly about Europe not paying enough, hinting that Ukraine must compromise, but still keeping the weapons and intelligence flowing. He wants Moscow to believe he can prolong the war indefinitely, even while he tells his own base that he'll end it in 24 hours. The problem is that Russia doesn't have to believe him. They're fighting a real war. They can see the front lines, the daily attrition, the failure of Ukrainian offensives, the economic strain in Europe, and the exhaustion in the American public. They can count. They know time is on their side. From the very beginning, Washington's strategic goal was not to save Ukraine, but to weaken Russia. Western officials and pundits were quite open about it at first. This was a great investment, killing Russians on the cheap with Ukrainian bodies without American soldiers coming home in coffins. Ukraine was extra cannon fodder in a proxy war. Notice what never featured in that triumphalist talk: Ukrainian casualties. The millions of displaced, the destroyed cities, the dead conscripts ripped off the streets, they simply did not matter to the planners. The cynicism went even deeper. In early 2022, when Russian forces crossed the border, there were peace talks in Istanbul. There was a real possibility, documented, not imagined, that the war could have been frozen early, with Russia agreeing to halt along lines that did not include some of the territory Moscow now openly claims. That would have preserved more land for Ukraine, saved tens of thousands of lives, and left Kyiv in a far stronger position than today. Instead, London and Washington intervened. The infamous visits and phone calls, the Boris Johnson shuttle diplomacy, were not to end the war, but to stop peace. The West wanted the conflict prolonged, not resolved. Russia adjusted accordingly. When it became clear that Western elites preferred bleeding both Ukrainians and Russians to any negotiated settlement, Moscow dropped earlier restraint. It annexed additional territories and dug in. By the time Western media admitted that the Istanbul track had been sabotaged, the lines on the ground had shifted, and the price for peace had gone up. That is not Russian intransigence. It is the direct consequence of Western escalation and Ukrainian leadership choosing to serve foreign interests instead of national survival. Inside Ukraine, Zelensky is trapped not only by his foreign patrons, but by forces at home that Washington and Brussels prefer to pretend do not exist. For years, hardline nationalist and neo-Nazi formations, Azov and others, have openly threatened to kill any Ukrainian leader who betrays the war effort by signing a compromise with Moscow. These groups already threatened Zelensky's predecessor, Poroshenko. They understand perfectly that as soon as someone signs a peace deal acknowledging territorial loss, the myth of inevitable victory shatters, and with it, the justification for all the deaths since 2014. They would rather lose slowly to the last Ukrainian than admit they cannot defeat Russia. Zelensky knows this. He knows that if he signs a peace deal before the situation becomes completely hopeless, those same forces could decide he stabbed the nation in the back. So instead, he allows the nation to be stabbed in the front day after day while posturing about moral grounds abroad. It is cowardice wrapped in rhetoric. On the battlefield, the war has long since ceased to resemble the early Western media fantasy of dramatic breakthroughs and liberating counteroffensives. The much heralded Ukrainian offensive of 2023 was a disaster. It proved that Kyiv has no meaningful offensive capacity against prepared Russian defenses. Since then, the front has been a grinding attritional slog. Russian troops advance slowly but steadily, village by village, taking heavy losses but inflicting heavier ones. Ukrainian forces dig in, fall back, and try to plug holes by mobilizing ever older and ever younger men. If you look at Russian maps, or even some Western analytical maps, you see an interesting pattern. Large concentrations of Ukrainian forces are not simply lined up along the hottest points of contact. Many units sit further north and west, away from the direct line of Russian contact. Some of this is operational prudence, some of it is brutal arithmetic. If you put your best units directly in front of Russian artillery and aviation every day, you burn through them at a rate you cannot sustain. So Kyiv tries to preserve its remaining structure by not committing everything to the front line at once. That allows the war to drag on, but it does nothing to reverse the underlying strategic picture. Russia continues to take ground, Ukraine continues to lose it. Both sides are suffering casualties. But the notion that Ukraine can outlast Russia in a war of attrition is fantasy. Russia has a larger population, a deeper industrial base, more artillery, more ammunition production, and strategic depth. Ukraine is already squeezing the last reserves of fighting-age men, dragging them off streets, buses, and workplaces. Moscow can sustain tens and hundreds of casualties a day for longer than Kyiv can sustain tens and hundreds without the whole society cracking. Meanwhile, European leaders keep telling their people a bedtime story about a Russian threat they themselves no longer seem to believe, but cannot stop repeating. They warn that if Russia is not stopped in Donbass, it will march to the Baltics, then Poland, then Berlin. They conjure visions of tanks rolling through Tallinn or Warsaw because they need fear to justify budgets. Yet they carefully avoid one basic fact. There is no ongoing civil war in Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, in which ethnic Russians are being shelled for years while peace agreements are sabotaged by Western interference. That was the unique combustible mix in Ukraine, and it was deliberately used as tinder. Vladimir Putin has said repeatedly that Russia has no interest in marching into Europe. Western media scoffs, but the behavior of Moscow on the ground tells its own story. The Kremlin moved forcefully into Ukraine because Ukraine had become a frontline NATO project right on Russia's border after years of conflict in Donbass and broken promises about neutrality. Russia has not launched comparable operations against NATO members filled with Russian minorities. The idea that Russian troops will just wake up one morning and decide to storm Tallinn or Vilnius for sport is propaganda designed to keep Europeans in a permanent state of infantilized fear. The most damning indictment of Western policy is not that the war is brutal. All wars are brutal. The indictment is that this one was avoidable, and that the people who could have stopped it chose escalation instead. Before the invasion, Russia demanded basic security guarantees: no NATO membership for Ukraine, implementation of the Minsk agreements granting autonomy to Donbass, and a neutral buffer instead of a hostile armed camp on its border. Western leaders pretended to negotiate while admitting later, Merkel, Hollande, Poroshenko, that they were only using Minsk to buy time to arm Kyiv. They lied to Moscow, they lied to their own publics, and they lied to Ukrainians. Then, when Russian tanks rolled, they rejected early chances to freeze the conflict. When Russia initially did not insist on grabbing all of Kherson and Zaporizhia, they still pushed Zelensky to refuse. When Moscow signaled a willingness to halt along more favorable lines in 2022, the West sent envoys to talk him out of it. Only after more blood, more destruction, and more territorial loss did Russia expand its formal claims. Western policy took a manageable crisis, turned it into a major war, then spent years telling its own citizens that this was the only moral course. The question now is not whether Russia or Ukraine deserve to win. Wars are not decided by moral scorecards on cable news. The question is how many more Ukrainian lives Western politicians and their proxies in Kyiv are prepared to spend on an unwinnable project. Because, make no mistake, the maximalist Western position, no territorial concessions, NATO membership for Ukraine, strategic defeat for Russia, is unattainable without direct NATO-Russia war. And that is a war Europe will not survive. In the end, this war exposes what Western elites really value. They do not value Ukrainian sovereignty. They shredded it by turning Kyiv into a puppet regime dependent on foreign funding and permission for every move. They do not value Ukrainian lives. They treat them as expendable variables in a geopolitical spreadsheet. They do not value truth. They oscillate between hysterical fear-mongering about a mythical Russian march to the Atlantic and tight-lipped silence about sabotaged peace deals and buried casualty figures. Russia, for its part, has been surprisingly consistent. It wants a neutral Ukraine recognition of the new realities on the ground and an end to NATO's open door project on its border. The longer the West refuses to accept that, the worse the eventual settlement will be for Kyiv. Those who insisted in 2022 that compromising then would reward aggression have ensured that Ukraine will now have to compromise from a weaker position, having lost more territory and more people. If there is any hope left for Ukrainians, it lies not in more empty promises from politicians in London or Washington, but in a brutal reckoning with reality. The path to peace runs through acknowledging that Ukraine will not retake Crimea, that Donbass will not be forced back into a hostile unitary state against its will, and that Russia is not going to be strategically defeated by sanctions and speeches. It runs through leaders willing to face down the extremists in Kyiv who would rather burn the country to the ground than sign a ceasefire. And it runs through Washington, admitting that using another nation as a battering ram against a nuclear power was a reckless criminal error. Until that happens, the war will drag on. Russia winning slowly, Ukraine losing slowly, Europe hollowing itself out economically, and American politicians using the conflict as a talking point, while real coffins, Russian and Ukrainian, go into real graves. Those who still care more about human lives than geopolitical theater should stop repeating propaganda slogans and start asking a simple question. If the outcome on the ground will, in the end, reflect Russia's advantage, why should one more Ukrainian die to delay the inevitable by a few months? This is not a comfortable question for Western elites, but it is the only honest one left.